In a city where everyone trusts the law, there is one man who bends it to his will, a man who hides his greed behind a robe of justice. He smiles in public, yet in secret. He cheats the very system he is meant to protect. This is the story of a judge whose loyalty is not to truth, but to power and the dangerous game he plays while the world believes he is blind to corruption. The judge was a man of great respect in the city. People called him wise, fair, and just, but behind the polished doors of his office, the truth was very different. No one saw the late nights, the secret meetings, and the envelopes exchanged quietly in shadowed hallways. The city's people trusted him to decide right from wrong, yet he decided only what served him best. The courtroom was his stage, and he played the role of the impartial judge perfectly. From the outside, it seemed as if justice flowed fairly in his hands, but inside, there was a pattern, a system he had perfected over years. Decisions that should have been simple were twisted by invisible hands, and those who dared to question him were subtly silenced or ignored. It was not violence he used, nor threats openly given. It was something far more cunning: deception, hidden documents, and bribery that no one could trace directly back to him. Money changed hands in plain sight, but no one dared look too closely. The judge had mastered the art of appearing innocent while acting entirely in his own interest. He had allies in high places, people who owed him favors, people whose loyalty could be bought, and people who feared exposure. Every ruling, every signature on a piece of paper, every nod in a meeting had a deeper purpose that only he understood. There was a rhythm to his days, a carefully controlled chaos that allowed him to operate freely without suspicion. The public never noticed, but the ripple of his actions reached far and wide. Businesses that should have failed prospered because of his secret rulings. Criminals who should have faced justice slipped through cracks carefully widened by his hands. In the eyes of the city, he was untouchable. In the shadows, he was a king in a world where only he controlled the law. Despite his outward confidence, there were moments when even he could feel the weight of what he was doing. Late at night, alone in his office, he would sometimes glance at the stacks of papers, the documents that carried his secret marks, and wonder how long he could keep it hidden. But these moments of doubt were brief, quickly pushed aside by his belief in his own cleverness. He had built his life on the certainty that no one could connect the dots, that no one could see the hidden threads he wove through the system. Every decision was calculated, every interaction carefully measured. He was careful not to leave fingerprints, literal or figurative, and he trusted only a few people fully, people who had proven their loyalty in ways money or fear could not buy. Yet even among his closest allies, he was cautious. Trust was a dangerous thing, and betrayal could end everything he had built. What made him dangerous was not just his corruption, but the way he hid it. To the world, he was the embodiment of fairness. His robes were symbols of honor, his courtroom a stage of integrity. But those who looked closer, those who dared notice the subtleties, began to see patterns, small inconsistencies, whispers of deals made behind closed doors, and a strange alignment of outcomes that always seemed to favor certain people. These were the first signs that something was wrong. He relied on the fact that most people never looked too hard. Society trusted the robes more than the man inside them, and he exploited that trust to the fullest. Every bribe, every secret favor, every act of manipulation was hidden under layers of bureaucracy, rules, and procedure. Even when confronted with questions, he deflected with charm, with eloquence, or with subtle intimidation. People left feeling confused, convinced they must be mistaken, while he walked away untouched, smiling politely, his secret safe behind a mask of authority. Yet, the longer he operated this way, the more dangerous it became. There were eyes watching, slowly piecing together the fragments he left behind. Evidence could slip through unnoticed, but a single slip, a single mistake, could unravel everything. And while he believed himself untouchable, fate has a way of exposing even the most careful lies. In the quiet moments of his office, while the city slept, he sometimes felt it a shadow, not of law enforcement, but of justice itself, creeping closer, patient, and unforgiving for now. He remained untouchable, operating in the perfect balance of fear, greed, and secrecy. But every system, no matter how cleverly manipulated, eventually cracks, and the higher the fall, the greater the spectacle when the truth finally comes to light. The city never slept, and neither did the secrets it held. Behind closed doors, deals were made that no one in the courtroom ever suspected. The judge had perfected a pattern that seemed random to outsiders, but followed a precise, invisible logic. Envelopes passed silently from hand to hand, briefcases exchanged in quiet corners, and meetings held in rooms with no windows, all carefully choreographed to avoid notice. The transactions themselves were subtle, almost mundane. A signature here, a nod there, a whisper of agreement over coffee. Yet each small act built a fortress of power around him, one that few could penetrate. The people who served him, knowingly or not, were pieces on a chessboard, each move calculated to secure his position and ensure the loyalty of those who might question him. He had learned long ago that absolute control required invisibility. Those who appeared closest to him were often the farthest from the truth. And even his own staff could not guess the depths of his manipulation. Every morning, he arrived at the courthouse with the same calm, measured steps. To the public, he was methodical and fair, reviewing case files with attention and care. Yet beneath the surface, the files themselves were sometimes altered before reaching the desk, reports quietly rewritten, and evidence subtly redirected to fit outcomes he had predetermined. Lawyers and plaintiffs believed they were presenting truth, unaware that the scales of justice had already been tipped. It was an art, this orchestration of perception. He was meticulous in every detail, from the placement of documents to the tone of his interactions, creating an illusion of impartiality that no one questioned. Over time, he had built a reputation so unassailable that even whispers of impropriety seemed impossible to believe. People trusted the robe, the gavel, the ceremony of law, never imagining that the man behind it could use it as a tool of personal gain. But the shadows never remain empty for long. Somewhere in the city, there were those who noticed anomalies, small patterns that refused to make sense. A case dismissed too quickly, a ruling that favored someone inexplicably, a document missing when it should have been there, all hints of a deeper scheme, almost invisible, yet consistent. Slowly, these fragments began to coalesce into suspicion. A team of quiet observers, people who worked in the margins of law and bureaucracy, began to follow the faint trails he left behind. They watched meetings through half-open doors, noted patterns in files, and captured fleeting glimpses of exchanges that would have gone unnoticed to anyone else. These were not the obvious investigators of television dramas, but persistent, patient people who understood the power of attention and timing. They knew the value of collecting small pieces over long periods, knowing that even the most careful man could not erase all traces of his wrongdoing. The judge, of course, was aware that eyes might be watching, though he rarely allowed the thought to disturb him. Paranoia was dangerous, but caution was essential. He changed routines, varied meetings, and created distractions to throw potential observers off his trail. Yet in his arrogance, he underestimated the determination of those who worked without recognition or fame. They did not need dramatic confrontations or sudden confrontations to gather evidence. They moved like shadows, silent and patient, letting the corrupt man continue his pattern until it became possible to connect the pieces. They were building a mosaic of truth from fragments, knowing that even the smallest slip could unravel years of deception. Meanwhile, the judge continued his performance flawlessly. To the casual observer, he was untouchable, walking the halls of justice with quiet confidence, attending ceremonial events, and speaking to the public with charm and authority. But in private, he moved with a precision born of experience, aware of every hand that approached him, every glance that lingered too long, every whisper that might contain suspicion. He had learned that power was a careful balance of visibility and concealment, and he played the role of the visible authority perfectly, while the true worked the bending of rules. The quiet shaping of outcomes happened beneath the surface, invisible to all but a few, yet even this careful design had vulnerabilities. The longer he manipulated the system, the more opportunities existed for an error, an overlooked detail, a subtle trace that could expose him. And the watchers, the quiet observers piecing together the truth, were patient enough to wait for it. The tension in the city was invisible but palpable, like a low hum beneath daily life. People went about their routines, unaware that justice itself was being quietly twisted, unaware that the man they trusted so completely was playing a dangerous game with consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. Every meeting, every decision, every signature carried hidden weight, and while the judge believed himself in complete control, the silent web of observation was tightening around him soon. The invisible lines would cross, and the secrets he had so carefully protected might no longer remain hidden. The first cracks in the judge's carefully constructed world began as barely noticeable ripples. A misfiled document here, a whispered conversation overheard, their small mistakes, insignificant on their own, but when collected, they painted a picture no one could ignore. The investigators, silent and patient, began to connect these fragments. Like pieces of a puzzle, every detail mattered: the timing of a meeting, the slight hesitation in a signature, the subtle pattern of decisions that seemed to favor certain individuals or businesses repeatedly. These anomalies, once invisible to the untrained eye, now formed an unmistakable thread, leading directly to the man who had long believed himself untouchable. He was still performing his role flawlessly in public, still receiving praise for fairness and wisdom, but behind the polished facade, a sense of unease began to grow. He could not yet see the full extent of the observation, but instinct whispered that the shadows he had ignored for so long were shifting closer. As the investigators collected evidence, they had to move like ghosts. They could not confront him directly. They could not risk being noticed. Every step was measured, every recording and document hidden carefully to avoid suspicion. They observed from rooftops, from park benches, and even from vehicles parked at a distance, capturing fleeting interactions and small exchanges that, when combined, revealed a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. The judge's network of favors, the hidden channels through which money and influence flowed, began to take shape on their files. Patterns emerged that no single observer could have discovered alone. But through patience and persistence, the mosaic of corruption became increasingly clear. They had begun to see how he manipulated the system, how carefully he masked his actions, and how deep his influence ran. The deeper they looked, the more dangerous it became. Not just for the judge, but for themselves. They were exposing a man who could ruin lives with a single nod, whose power was both vast and subtle, and whose knowledge of the law made him almost untouchable. Yet they continued, driven by the belief that truth was stronger than fear. The judge, however, was not oblivious to the growing tension. He noticed small changes in the way people interacted, subtle hesitation in familiar faces, the way certain documents disappeared temporarily only to return altered in ways he did not recognize. He felt the first pricklings of paranoia, an awareness that the perfect balance he had maintained for years might be slipping. But he was not one to act rashly. Instead, he doubled down on his control, adding layers of complexity to his network, increasing the secrecy of his meetings, and using his charm and authority to divert suspicion. To anyone looking from the outside, everything remained as orderly and precise as ever. He continued to smile in public, continued to rule in the courtroom, continued to appear unflawed. Yet beneath the surface, the first tremors of exposure were beginning to shake the foundations of his carefully managed empire. The tension between control and exposure grew with every passing day. Small victories for the investigators. A document, photographed here, a secret exchange captured the added pressure that was invisible but real. Every decision the judge made now carried hidden consequences. The very act of continuing his schemes became a risk. each movement a potential misstep that could unravel the years of careful deception. At night, when he thought himself alone, he sometimes sensed a shadow in the corner of the room, a lingering doubt, the feeling of unseen eyes following his every move. He could not pinpoint the source, but he knew instinctively that something was coming. The longer he ignored it, the stronger it would become. The invisible web of scrutiny was tightening, and his freedom, once absolute, now depended on flawless execution, vigilance, and luck. By this point, the story was no longer one of casual corruption. It had become a tense battle of wits. The judge relied on deception, skill, and the loyalty of a few trusted allies. The investigators relied on patience, observation, and careful accumulation of proof. Each side operated in silence, the stakes hidden beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, yet enormous. The city remained unaware of the invisible struggle unfolding in its midst, but every move the judge made now carried risk. Every decision could leave traces, and every ally could be a liability. The quiet observers were closing in, and with each day, the possibility of exposure grew. The world might continue to see him as untouchable, but the invisible narrative was shifting. What had once seemed secure was now fragile, and the first tremors of the truth promised a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. The quiet tension that had been building for weeks erupted in subtle, irreversible ways. The judge, who had always believed himself untouchable, began to feel the walls of his carefully constructed world closing in. Small details that had been invisible for years suddenly became glaring threats. A missing file reappeared on a desk with annotations he did not recognize. A whispered conversation that should have been private was recorded in fragments he could not control. Even his closest allies, loyal as they seemed, began to act with hesitation, their subtle unease betraying the cracks in his network. The city around him continued to function as if nothing had changed, but in the shadows, the invisible forces of exposure were converging. Every move he made now carried a weight far greater than before, and for the first time, he realized that the patterns he had relied upon so long could no longer shield him from the truth. The investigators moved carefully, knowing that confrontation was dangerous, but that opportunity was finally within reach. They had pieced together enough evidence to draw a clear picture of his corruption, and now it was only a matter of timing. Every document they had gathered, every silent observation, every hidden recording formed a mosaic of undeniable proof. They did not need witnesses in the conventional sense. The facts themselves were enough to speak. The shadows they had occupied for weeks now coalesced into a single force aimed at revealing the man behind the robe. The thrill of discovery mixed with the tension of risk, each step toward exposure requiring patience, precision, and nerve. They knew the judge was clever, and they knew he would attempt to cover his tracks at the first sign of danger. But the mosaic was complete, and nothing could undo the careful accumulation of truth. The judge could sense the pressure mounting, an intangible presence that seemed to follow him through every hallway, every courtroom, every quiet office. He attempted to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but subtle missteps began to accumulate. A signature left unchecked, a meeting that ended with too many questions, a document that reached the wrong hands. Each small error was magnified in the context of growing scrutiny. For the first time, he felt the weight of consequences he had long believed he could control. His mind, once a fortress of confidence and calculation, began to betray him with doubts, second-guessing, and fear. He understood, in a way he never had before, that every empire built on deception carries an expiration date, and that the higher the rise, the more devastating the fall. As the culmination of events approached, the city itself remained oblivious. Life continued in ordinary routines. The gavel still struck in empty courtrooms, and the public remained unaware that the figure they had trusted was teetering on the edge of exposure. Yet in the shadows, the invisible observers moved with precision, assembling the final pieces of proof. They had waited patiently for the right moment, and now that moment was near. The evidence, once collected, could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The judge's power, once absolute, was suddenly fragile, vulnerable to the relentless, unseen force of truth when the first undeniable sign of exposure occurred. It was almost anticlimactic. A single document, previously hidden and overlooked, arrived in the hands of someone who could act on it. The chain reaction was swift and inevitable. Allies became cautious, conversations were filtered, and the carefully maintained illusion of control began to crumble. Panic replaced confidence, hesitation replaced certainty. And the once untouchable figure felt the weight of his deception, pressing down. Every decision, every carefully constructed layer of secrecy was now under scrutiny. The world he had manipulated so easily was slipping from his grasp, and for the first time, he could not calculate the outcome.